Good evening, everyone. Tonight is August 2nd already, 2023. It's 6:08 p.m. I would like to call to order the Columbus City Council and Planning Commission meeting. Our first order of business will be the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As we meet and discuss, I'll ask everyone to please mute your phones and be sure to speak into your microphone, please. On to a motion to approve the meeting agenda. Do I hear a motion?
I'll make a motion.
And is there a second?
This is Janet, I second.
I'll call for the vote, and I'll start with Sue.
Sue, I.
Lynn, I.
Janet, I.
Barb, aye.
Judy, I.
Rob, aye.
Bethany, aye.
And Jesse, aye. How about a motion to approve the joint City Council and Planning Commission meeting from June 7th, 2023?
This is Janet. I move to approve the June 7th, 2023 Joint City Council and Planning Commission meeting minutes.
And is there a second?
This is Sue, I'll second.
I'll call for the vote.
Sue, I.
Lynn, I.
Janet, I.
Barb, aye.
Judy, abstain.
Rob, abstain.
Bethany, aye.
And Jesse, aye. On to number 5. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak at the public open forum? Or is there anyone online who would like to speak? Hearing none, we'll move on to number 6. City Council and Planning Commission discussion of residential zone business ordinance. Presentation with materials at the meeting tonight. So who would like to begin with that?
I think that's me, Mr.
All right.
Mayor. Right, well, good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council and planning commissioners, Megan Rogers with the City Attorney's Office. And tonight we are going to discuss the existing ordinance for what we have. We have 2 categories. We have residential zone businesses and we have home occupations. And I have a PowerPoint that I have provided to all of you to follow along with, and we'll share as well to our folks who are listening over Zoom. But really the structure of this evening's conversation is to talk about what we have today, the process that you went through over about the last 18 months in talking about these issues, and then a staff proposal for a path forward, taking into account some of the policy work you did around this issue during the course of the residential zone business moratorium. So right now you have 3 categories where you're allowing operation of businesses within your rural residential district. They are a home occupation and your residential zone business. And you have, along with the PowerPoint handout, you also have the actual ordinance as it exists today. So the code language that I handed out earlier this evening is the language that's in your code as it stands now. So home occupation is a occupation or business activity intended to generate a profit and conducted in a dwelling unit. And it's a business that only the people who live in the home, who reside on the premises, can be engaged in that business. The use of the dwelling has to be, for the business purpose, has to be incidental and subordinate to its residential purpose. And then there are some restrictions in terms of the actual square footage of the home, the garage that can be used for those business purposes. There cannot be a change in the outside appearance of the building. There's very limited and restricted signage as well. The traffic that's generated by a home occupation must be limited to the standard traffic that you would see in a neighborhood. And so we're not expecting, 100+ vehicles coming in and out over the day. These are standard traffic numbers that would be, 1 or 2 people, potentially a person an hour, let's say, would be a reasonable traffic standard for anyone living in a regular neighborhood or in our rural residential district. And then there is an allowance for a parking lot, so additional parking that's available on the property. It has to be particularly located along the side or the rear of the home. And then there are further restrictions in terms of noise, odors, vibrations, those types of things that limit the intensity of the type of business, and outdoor storage is prohibited. So that's what your home occupation looks like, and that's one class, that's one category that exists today. Then you have a secondary category that's permitted via an interim use permit, and that's your residential zone business. So that requires an interim use permit process, which of course means that they are coming before the Planning Commission, the applicant's coming before the Planning Commission, they're coming before the City Council, and they're seeking flexibility for the operation of a business. They are also required then to comply with a long list of performance standards that you have within your code today. And those performance standards are within your packet here that you can look at specifically, but our next slide, I've sort of detailed them out in terms of what the gist of these standards are. So number one, these cannot be rental properties. You know, they're in the rural residential district, they're in interim use, they have to go through the interim use permit process. Interim uses as compared to conditional uses are temporary in nature. They are issued for a period of time and then they need to be renewed. They are subject to the conditions of approval that you would put on any conditional use permit. And that's the process that one would go through in applying for a residential zone business. They do allow, this provision does allow for employees. It does allow for exterior storage of materials with screening. It also, it allows for sort of a broader, I would say, general impact. It has, again, when you have employees, that's more traffic, more cars, more people coming in and out. The business starts to look more like a business and less like a home. The application has to identify the hours of use. It has to have screening attached to it. It has to have parking limitations and all of those things that you regularly see within your conditional use permit process. But it also contains a specific term, and that is that the residential zone business must be invisible. And this is the term that received a lot of conversation in your policy conversations around adopting a revised ordinance. And so that leads me into what have we talked about for the last several months. So the City Council adopted a residential zone business moratorium in November of 2021 and undertook a comprehensive planning study of its residential zoned business operations. That moratorium, number one, it put a hold on any renewals that were required during that time for interim use permits, so it allowed people to continue operations. And it did have a savings clause in there that allowed people who had already started making the investment in an interim use permit to come in and to seek approval from the Planning Commission, the City Council, during the course of the moratorium. The moratorium expired on its own terms. Moratoria, generally speaking, for planning issues can last for 1 year unless special circumstances apply. It expired during the course of the planning study this last fall. And at the time that you adopted the moratorium, the City Council directed the Planning Commission to study three things. The existing residential zone businesses and home occupations. So where do they exist and how are they operating? The impacts of broader commercial uses on residential neighborhoods, and then to undertake a definition of what a business is. And during the course of the conversations with city staff around trying to define this, a number of approaches were discussed that are prevalent in other cities. So that included having different levels of residential zone businesses or home occupations. That also talked about a lot of different performance standards. So how heavy could a truck be that was associated with a broader based residential zone business? How would you monitor that? And ultimately, the City Council and the Planning Commission, in the reviewing those meetings, struggle to get to a practicable solution that address the underlying concern, which is ultimately you have a residential district and you have a commercial district. And we want to push, generally as a city, commercial uses into the commercial districts where there's lots of flexibility to open businesses, there's new land on the market, there's buildings being built all of the time to accommodate those uses, and there's space in place to do that within Columbus, rather than in your residential district, which have a variety, which can have a variety of impacts on maintaining homes and maintaining that residential character. So with that in mind, I went back through the meetings that you all had, and these were the main issues. I'll have you go back one, Elizabeth, thank you. The main issues that were addressed during the moratorium were traffic, parking, this definition of invisibility, and how do you write a code that gives clear and discrete standards for what invisible means, how commercial business within the residential district impacts surrounding properties, noise, odors, and again, as I just said, the real distinction between commercial and residential sections of the city. And so with that in mind, at this point in time, I'm happy to take comments and questions on generally the process that we've been through, but I also have a proposal for you. So I will leave it up to the council and the planning commission to see if you want to check in now or if you're ready for me to lay out what I think our next steps forward can be.
This is Janet. I just have two things quickly to say. I think the other bullet point under the moratorium study that you didn't mention, but maybe you intended it to sort of be part of the distinction between the commercial and residential portions, was that I think there was an attention to how do you also do this, allowing residential property owners to get the best use to their land without creating an unfair advantage to our commercial businesses that are paying the commercial taxes and operating in that area. Clearly, if you're operating a business out of your house or your home or your pole barn or all the above, you're not paying the commercial taxes. Even if you've come forward and done an IUP, the assessor will assess a portion of your property that's being used, but it's not being assessed. They're not required to build according to commercial standards and things like that. So there's definitely a financial advantage, and I think that was one of the other things that we were trying to pay attention to as well. And I think the other, and this is just sort of more of a semantics thing, we talked a lot about what the terminology meant, or what the words that we were using meant, and we kind of landed on the fact that nobody else but us uses residential zone business, and so we were moving towards home occupation 1 and home occupation 2, which is more consistent with what other communities use, and I think I would like to see us continue that, because there have been a number of examples where especially realtors misunderstand our code because they have one definition in their mind and they don't know what a residential zone business is. So I think it'd be good for us to try to be more consistent with what the surrounding communities are using.
All right. So I think that's absolutely sort of in the lines of where we're going here and what our proposal is for your consideration this evening. So our next slide has the staff proposal, and it's this. In looking at the existing language in your code, home occupation is a much less intense standard. Residential zone business has complicating factors. It has employees, it has additional traffic, it has a more intense use. And so what we're proposing is to seek your direction on refining the definition of home occupation, eliminating residential zone businesses entirely as a concept, but allowing existing permit holders, so those people who have an interim use permit or were in operation prior to the adoption of the interim use ordinance, to continue their operations as they exist today. So you would not have new, what we'll call historic residential zone businesses within the city you would only have home occupations as further defined within your code. And what that does, and sort of drawing this distinction there, is that the residential zone businesses are those broader commercial uses. We would, through this process, preserve those people who have those rights today, but we would stop the expansion of that type of business within your residential districts.
So that seems like a really different direction than what we've been going through over the last 18 months, because we spent a lot of time talking specifically about how many employees, you know, if they could have an extra person, but it only could be one, and they could have this many parking spaces. So what you're recommending is eliminating any new residential home business.
Eliminating any residentially zoned business as we understood them to be prior to the moratorium, but retaining home occupations. And so I think we can talk about what home occupations are, because they're going to give flexibility for those uses that don't have significant traffic, that don't have significant impacts on surrounding neighbors, that are closer to that invisibility line that the council discussed. So still flexibility for people who are working from home, still flexibility for the folks who have a truck that they bring home from work, of course, still flexibility for people who are who are a sole proprietor, who are running an electrician's shop, and they've got a truck and they've got supplies and they've got those things. Those are all still in play. What wouldn't be in play really is where you have a small business with employees coming to and from the home over the course of a business day, and also when you have any outside storage of piles of dirt, of refuse, of materials. So thinking about those businesses that can be operated by the person who is the main proprietor, that they can store materials in their pole barn and all of those types of things. The person who is fixing a vehicle, like a one-man auto body shop, that's still in play. A person who's cutting hair, a therapist, all of those are contemplated underneath our existing home occupation definition, and you can create additional flexibility there if you need it. But what wouldn't be permitted is for a business that has employees. And I think the employees is really the determining factor between a home occupation and a residential zone business. And I'll let
Outdoor stores and outdoor storage.
and outdoor storage, right.
Okay, and so what was that decision based on? Was it that mainly, or, just the whole direction, the change in direction? Was that based solely on that?
So, ultimately the goal here is to try to meet the policy objectives that you outlined in those conversations. And in those policy objectives, to me, and listening back to those meetings, were really related to traffic impacts, exterior storage, and impacts to surrounding neighborhoods. But the mechanism that we had sort of outlined in that draft ordinance had a lot of triggers for enforcement. So you're allowed to have outdoor storage, or you're allowed to have this type of truck if you live on a city street that's built up to this level. Well, my concern related to that is, number one, how does your applicant bring that to you? How do we accept that information as part of the interim use permit process? And then how do we move forward with enforcing it? So we have an applicant that comes in and says, yep, I've got a 10-ton truck that's coming in here. We're going to have some dumping that's going to occur during the day. We're moving dirt. We're doing all this. It will be all screened, but then, and we estimate it will be, 10 trucks a day. And when that comes before you here, it seems like a reasonable expectation that the street can accommodate it, all of those things. But what if that truck is actually 12,000 tons? Or, I'm not a good tonnage on truck. I'll let Dean stand in on what type of trucks there are. But what happens when those conditions are not met? And I think it's really important. So whenever we're crafting a zoning ordinance, we want to be objective and we want to be consistent. And so we want to have objective standards that can be met and that can be implemented not only by the applicant, but also by our staff when they're moving forward to do enforcement and ensuring they're in compliance with the interim use. And by taking this approach, you create a permitted use where it says, yes, we are comfortable from a policy perspective with someone running a hair salon out of their home, with someone operating a electrical company or a landscaping firm, as long as they don't have other employees that are coming on a regular basis. And it seems like this is a way to streamline it and create flexibility for people using the large lots that we have in Columbus in an effective way, but without also having those side effects on the surrounding properties.
So my other question is, when we did the study, we looked at all the other cities around us and what they, Hugo, some of the cities that have the same lot size that we have, and they have a lot, we were kind of gearing towards what they have. So are we going to be a lot different then, more restrictive than some of the other cities around us?
So this would be more restrictive than Hugo, for example, but it would be more consistent with Rosemont. It would be more consistent with Roseville. It would be very much consistent with what we're seeing in what I would call second ring suburbs on a broader basis. And also, again, cities are moving towards. So there's policy considerations that cities are taking into account in this because the way that we work has changed so significantly. And it has two impacts. Number one, we have more people who are working from home who may be consultants, may be operating in different ways, and we want to make sure that's a permitted use. We don't want to start triggering code enforcement violations because someone is operating, this small, what never looked before like a small business, but now is a small business because of how the world of work has changed. But the second thing I think that's also for you to consider that's changed over the course, not necessarily of the moratorium period, but just in our world in general, is that we have more people who are working from home. And so those daily impacts that we see with people with more intense uses, like what our residential zone business used to permit, or permits to this day, I should say, for those people who are working from home and are adjacent property owners, they're going to hear those noises. They're going to experience that intensity, even if you have significant open and close hour restrictions, because more people are home. And a number of cities are facing this, and specifically looking at this with regards to their mining ordinances. So for years, residential properties existed around existing mines without sort of experiencing the impacts of mine traffic and the sounds of day-to-day mining because people were off at work. But now that people are home, there's much more sort of that intense lived experience of hearing the sounds that come from the mine. And you're seeing in Anoka County, Washington County, and really throughout the metro area, significant revisions for those cities that still allow mining, significant revisions to those ordinances for that particular reason. And I think you can think of some of these things as similar in terms of the impacts that they have. We have a changed impact, not only of more people working from home, but then also if you have a more intense use, how does that impact those other people who are working from home?
So I have a question. In our previous discussion, and when we had like a home occupation 1 and 2, there was one that required a permit and one that did not. Would we still be going down that path where there would be a use that wouldn't require a permit because it's somebody using part of their basement as an office and there's one person and there's no customers and there's no parking and there's none of that?
None of them would require a permit.
Yeah, so none of these would require a permit. The only thing we would require is registration with the city. And that allows, in your existing home occupation ordinance, you have some performance standards. Specifically, you have requirements in terms of parking and you have some requirements in terms of screening. We would want to ensure that those things are in place. And so we would have a limited site plan review that would be completed by staff, but no formal permit process.
So I thought I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So I thought I heard you say that these would require an interim use permit, but then you just said they wouldn't require a permit.
No, there would be no interim use permit required. So
For any of the home occupations?
for any of the home occupations. So we're eliminating the residential zone business, the more intense occupations, the ability to apply for one of those. That would be off the table under staff's recommendation. It would only be home occupations that would be a permitted use. And then we would look at the definition of home occupation. We would have a very clear definition and a process for notifying the city when you're starting your home occupation and a site plan review process.
So there would not be any ability to put conditions or anything like that?
No,
You either fit or you don't?
that's correct.
And then if you have existing businesses, existing residential zone businesses today, I think I understood you say the intent is not to put them out of business, but to create a pathway that they can become compliant. And so can you go more into that?
Absolutely. So operators that are in existence prior to, so a couple of things. The IUP requirement has been around for at least 10 years. We believe potentially more. And so anyone who has an existing IUP today would have 12 months to come in to ensure compliance with the ordinance as drafted and with the conditions of approval. So that would address screening considerations. It would make sure that everything is as agreed to and as put in place by the council that approved the IUP. And those users that took that process within the next 12 months after adoption of the ordinance would be essentially have that as their permitted use. So that would set the guidelines for their use. It couldn't be expanded without further application to the city and all of those types of things, but that would be the process. The sort of as we're thinking about it from a policy standpoint, so it has to be granted prior to the moratorium, granted underneath the existing IUP ordinance. If it was in place prior to the IUP ordinance requirement, they would have to show some proof of longstanding operation at the site. If they'd receive the benefit of a permitted use, no current complaints or enforcement action pending, and then inspections to confirm screening, equipment is stored inside, no piles of waste or refuse, and all of the other conditions that the previous councils determined related to the IUP. If a permit was denied, there would be an appeal process to the city council. So, if this we can talk about it as grandfathering or legally nonconforming use, but ultimately, if for some reason staff determined that the applicant was outside of compliance, then it would come to you for approval.
And if it's a residential zone business that isn't operating under IUP right now, which the vast majority of them are in that category, what happens with them?
So they would have the opportunity to prove up that they were operating prior to the IUP ordinance. But if they never came in and applied for the IUP and they have no other sort of longstanding operation protection, they would not be allowed to continue to operate.
So we'd put them
Unless they comply with home occupation.
Unless they comply with the home occupation, right? Unless they come in under that permitted use category.
So this is Rob. Currently, as we were working through this process, we were kind of telling people that didn't have an IUP, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe we weren't, just hold on, we're trying to figure this thing out. So now we have ones that don't have an IUP that wanted to get in here quick to get one before the moratorium happened, so that they would be covered as, legal non-conforming if we went that way. Now we're just gonna throw those businesses out of business, and meanwhile, they don't have a time to go find a place to start a commercial use, nor is maybe that even an option, right? And then furthermore, I think, I said this before, people move out here because they have 20, 40 acres and, the neighbor thing's not an issue. They might be doing an operation in the middle of their property, and it's rarely excavating. Sometimes it is. We've ran into that, right? I don't think any of us are friendly of their neighbor excavating their property, but an auto mechanic that's been here for 50 years or, something like that, now we're just gonna tell them, well, you didn't have an IUP or go away.
I think a couple things here. So number one, the person who's been there for 50 years they're coming in under
That
this
might be
compliance
extreme, but-
process, right? But like 25 years, 15 years, they're going to provide proof of ongoing operation. It's a known. They need to be in compliance with the code as it exists today. So if they don't have existing screening that they should have had because they didn't have an IUP or they didn't come before you for review, they need to bring that property into compliance within the next. So there's notice, right? So the goal here is to have notice for existing businesses, to work with those who have IUPs, to come in to ensure that they're in compliance and to move forward and to protect their use. For those people who perhaps are in a bit of a gray area, to work with them to come into compliance with the existing use, but to otherwise stem the applications, right? And so this is about protecting what has been and changing the path moving forward. But that path moving forward is not a closed door to the auto mechanic that runs a shop with his daughter, because that's family members who are operating a business out of their home. It is to stem the auto body shop or the retail center that's currently operating within a residential district, and to push those uses into the commercial space.
The idea too is also to look at the home occupation currently the way it is. Right now, there's 9 conditions, and you have to meet them, or you automatically go into the residential zone business. But I think if you tweak the home occupation definition, and you might expand it a little bit in order to capture most of the existing businesses today, and then you have a program where they have to be licensed, so we know which ones have businesses. So if we do get complaints, we can send Sean out and he can, look at them and figure out what the issue is.
Well, and so let's take a look at let's see, a slide in front of here, the next slide over, I believe.
Next one.
Yep. Talks about our definition of home occupation. Oh, one more, sorry. Back, sorry. There we go, the home occupation.
Very sensitive today.
So this is the definition that you have in your code today, and I think it's actually a little bit broader than we've given it credit for. So number one, it's a commercial use, still a commercial use within a residential district. Number two, no persons other than the family who reside on the premises shall be engaged in such occupation. Right? The purpose of this section is to cut off employees. We can revise this definition to be more sort of inclusive of things that you want, but I think that we're again looking to say that we're not having employee traffic coming in and out on a regular basis. So I think that there's room here to sort of build on the policy considerations and the flexibility that you do want to provide for people, because this is a community with large homes and large lots. So we can also look, as we go back to that idea of objective and consistent metrics, that's what we want to create, so that we don't have a realtor coming in and saying, oh yeah, you absolutely can have this operation, all you need is this IUP, or you're a home occupation, that's fine. So create these indicia. So right now we have this set at not more than 20% of the floor area of the dwelling unit, and not more than 300 square feet of any garage or accessory building can be used. Those numbers can be modified to create more flexibility if that's something that the council is interested in pursuing. So a broader definition of that home occupation. I think that part of the core of your residential zone business code, in combination with the home occupation definition, is this concept of invisibility, so that it should be consistent with the surrounding properties. And what you have in the home occupation definition is that there's no change in the outside appearance of the building or premises except for a very specific sign. I think that that's consistent with what you're looking for, and consistent with what many of the businesses who are currently operating within your rural residential district have. And then this speaks to traffic. No traffic shall be generated by the home occupation in greater volume than would be normally expected in a residence in a residential neighborhood. And Dean can speak to what those numbers look like. But But that's still anticipating. I mean, we can just think even colloquially about how do people come and use your home, the type of traffic that we have from Amazon deliveries every day. I think there's something showing up at my house at least once a day, just from an Amazon delivery person. That type of traffic is very much reasonable. So someone coming to see a therapist on an hourly basis, that's maybe 9 patients over the course of the day. That would be regular and reasonable traffic for the neighborhood. Same thing would be true with a hairstylist or a nail salon. All of those businesses would fall currently under your existing home occupation definition. Same thing would be true for an automobile shop, someone dropping off of a vehicle. And then importantly, so we have a parking lot section in here, and that would be sort of, Elizabeth and I talked a little bit about the concept of parking versus storage. So to keep the flexibility for parking, but to limit exterior storage, and that's already in the ordinance today. And then, of course, the generalized prescriptions on noise, vibrations, glare, fumes, odors, dust. Those are the types of impacts that are going to have sort of the most, well, impact. I mean, how many times can I use the word? But the most, that's what neighbors are going to see. That's what's going to change the quality and the character of a residential neighborhood. So I think it's really helpful to talk again in specifics about the types of businesses that you want to be able to see operate within these districts and whether or not it falls within this home occupation. Because I think the significant concerns about traffic and noise and odor all comes with a more dense application of a commercial business within the residential district.
This is Barb. I have a question. Is there going to be anything written up here regarding all of the businesses that don't have an IUP? There's been a lot of chatter and gossip and ringing of,
Well, this is a policy question for you all to answer in terms of how you desire to treat those businesses. What we initially proposed was this idea of if you had an existing business and you could prove it up, that we were going to give you 12 months to come into compliance, and then you would have it as a permitted use that runs with your property, a real value. If that's not capturing the entirety of the people who you desire to capture, then we can talk about what that looks like and what that prove up level is.
My question is, there are a lot of people that do not inform themselves. They don't read the ordinances, even though they're online, and they talk among themselves. Is there some way to get some communication out there where they are notified so we can dissuade anyone from making things up? Some way to educate people about what the truth is.
So a public information-based approach is always excellent. You can build that into your timeline. We've done it. Specifically with the CI district conversations, we had a long run up to adoption of an ordinance. We can send out, well, I'll let Elizabeth.
So explain to me a little bit about businesses that you think are outside of this, because the only businesses that I can think of that are outside of this are the ones we get complaints about. So the dumpster business on Pine Street, that should not be there. He's got open dumpsters that puts garbage all over the place. We have a recycling business that has over 100 appliances there. I mean, there are businesses that should not be in the residential district at all. It's outdoor storage. People don't like it. They complain. They don't like the trucks going up and down the road. So explain to me a business that you think would be outside of what we're talking about, because we're hearing other things from people.
Yep.
And I know there are some exceptions there are businesses that have CUPs, and that's outside of what we're talking about today. If they have a conditional use permit, they're going to be there forever because they're going to keep that permit. But what businesses, even Rob, what businesses are you looking at that we can't fit into this?
Right.
I'm not thinking of any.
I think of one on Notre Dame. I think he'd reached out during this, and I guess I don't want to throw a company name out there. You know who I'm talking
Yep.
about, right? They work for the city. They're a contractor of the city, and we're going to throw them under the bus.
I don't think they, but I do think that in that case, they've been here over 15 years. So you know what I mean, we did look at some of those businesses that are long-term businesses, and that is one, and it's actually even, it's way more than that. So the ones that are, you know what I mean, the ones that I can think of are all over 15 years. And Barb, to address your issue, I have asked Sean to reach out to the Secretary of State's office so that we can get a running list, you know what I mean, of businesses that are registered with the state. I think it's the only way that we're going to know who has a business, because you know, you can send as many newsletters as you want. Only the people who read the newsletter are going to get informed. So, but if we have a list of businesses, we can certainly send out a mailer and say, hey, these are the new rules, and this is what you need. This is what you need to do in order to operate a business. Here's a set of rules. Can you meet these rules? And if you can't, then you can't have a business. To me, it's cut and dry. Either you meet the rules or you don't meet the rules. And for those who have not met the rules, they're, especially when it comes to employees, that is a trigger, you know what I mean, for most neighbors, especially now that they're home. We have more complaints now than we did in the past, because there is a lot of people who are home now and working from home, and they see everything going on in the neighborhood. So I think if we think through, do we really want, and I don't think you want, but the John's Black Dirt, you know what I mean, kind of excavators and trucks up and down, and those, I mean, those kind of businesses I think are long, you know what I mean, a time where it was okay, and now it's not okay, I think, to have excavating and big dump trucks, especially on gravel roads. We get a lot of complaints about dust, and
And I don't mean to cut you off, but kind of going back to Sue, what Sue was saying is I feel like we're so far away from where we were when we were talking about it, like as council and even planning. I know the planning commission's changed quite a bit over the last couple of years, but you
Well,
know, I
that's what I'm
feel like
getting at.
we're so far away. We were talking about you can't have a business unless you have 5 acres. We don't want to have businesses on small lots, things like that. Now it's just kind of like, yeah, if you're not working in your basement, we don't want you here.
But that's it. But if you look at this definition, you can still use your house, you can still use your accessory building, you can
300
still,
square feet,
I'm sorry?
300 square feet.
But we can change that.
Which we can
Yeah.
change,
Which
right?
we can change. So I think that if you think of the businesses and you change, because I will say the standard accessory building in Columbus is 1,200 square feet. I know very few people who build smaller, and if they do, they have 2. So I do think that 300 square feet is on the small side, and I would say you would have to go to at least 600 square feet, or half the accessory building, or even the whole accessory building. What would be the downside of saying they can use whatever building they want on the property as long as it's inside?
Exactly.
So I think that's the flexibility we're looking at and saying, okay, let's look at home occupation and figure out how do we get to invisible, no traffic impacts, no odor, no vibrations, all of the things that people complain about. How do we get there through performance standards and have a business list and say, you know what, if you want a business in Columbus, you're going to sign up for the business and you're going to pay commercial taxes on those, on that business. Because when you sign up, we're going to send it over to the county. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. I'm just saying that equity thing between the residential properties and the commercial properties should happen, you know what I mean, in the big picture.
So can I ask, just to clarify that answer just a little bit further, because this is, my mind is still processing this change. When we started it, I thought there was a lot of residents that were calling in and saying they wanted to start a new business. It was COVID, they wanted to do it from home. We had all these new things that people wanted to do, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to define it a little bit better, because it was unclear. And maybe that's changed again back the other way. I mean, we're wanting to change it back the other way, but do you think we're getting less calls for residents that want to have a larger business on their property? Or, I mean, has something changed where it's not that big of a deal anymore, and we think we can accommodate the few, the majority of the ones, the 80% of the ones that were coming to us with just tweaking the one that we have?
I think during COVID, people were really thinking outside the box. I mean, food trucks and yard sales and anything you can think of, because they wanted to figure out what they could do if they didn't have their 9-to-5 job going to work. So those phone calls have slowed down a little bit because I think people have decided to do whatever it is they want to do. But I do think that Columbus as a whole, there are a lot of entrepreneurs. I mean, there are a lot of people who have businesses. So I think accommodating that makes it better for the city, because you are giving them a vehicle to be compliant, but then you're not going so far that you have an excavation business, you have a trucking business, then you have 10 employees coming to a property, because basically, essentially, then you're just changing a residential neighborhood into a commercial neighborhood. I mean, with all those impacts, and then you are going to have a boatload of complaints. So this was kind of a meet in the middle, because I think we struggled when we were talking, at least amongst the planning commission, what
Yes.
size trucks, you know,
Yeah, I
how
agree
much,
with
you know,
that. We
gravel and all that
struggled.
stuff. And I think we got way into the weeds where we weren't moving forward in seeing the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I asked Megan to do was isolate those impacts, and let's create performance standards to eliminate those impacts, and then let people do what they want to do. You know, let them use their buildings and let them use their property, but don't impact your neighbors. And that's what we tried to come up with today, and really it was for feedback from all of you.
And I would just also just like to ask Dean what his opinion is, unless were you part of the staff recommendations, or do you have any thoughts about our big change?
I was just getting into a comfortable sleep.
I know, I saw that. So we thought, might as well wake you up a little bit.
I told Megan I had a late night last night, and if I'm doing this, it wasn't about her content. I can tell you this is one of the biggest debated issues, and the way communities resolve it is to maintain a pure, true home occupation that nobody misunderstands. No outside employees, no. If you're a truck driver, you might fall in that, but you got to put it in a building. And if everybody's got a, what'd you say, 30 by 40 minimum?
It's
You can-
1,200.
you
I don't know
can
why
fit
it's
an over-the-road
1,200. That must be a
vehicle.
package or a deal.
Okay, and this varies across the board depending on the type of community. You're unique because you have a bunch of 1-acre lots, and we've got some people that experience closeness of neighbors. Some of you got large acreage, and you're like, why does government have to come in here and do this? I guarantee you, no matter what you finally adopt and put as a regulation, bonehead over here is going to break the rules. You say, we're not going to have more than 2 employees, and then neighbors blow the whistle and they've got 3. You can't have more than 2 trucks. Somebody calls in and, well, they've got 3. And so it never ends. I think what I'm hearing is this is a real clean break from having conflict in the future. And turn that off. You end up having, lost my train of thought.
Conflict in the future.
Clean break.
Clean break.
Break, yep.
Columbus.
See, I've got a new hearing aid that my phone rings directly into.
Oh, no wonder you jumped.
I don't know if you heard that.
No.
No,
Because I thought I turned my phone off, and then, wow.
Yeah, you looked a little surprised.
Yeah. Well, I've been around grandkids too much the last 5 weeks, so that's part of it too. This is a pure policy decision, and it involves, are we interfering with people's private rights, property rights, or are we concerned about? You have to make that decision. I heard Rob use the term throw them under the bus. That usually is kind of an extreme way to say we're abandoning them. We're turning our backs on them, but that's what happens in every community. That's the truth. We vote differently, we have different churches, everything's different, and this is pure policy. So what I'm hearing is you treat a home occupation for what any community meant it to be, that you are invisible, you are transparent. I have a home occupation. I don't rent office space anymore for my business. I have no employees. It works great. And even if the mayor calls and wants to meet on something, I don't let him come to my house, so I don't break any rules. You're a little different here, and more agricultural, rural communities hit that limit when the types of businesses that you hear most about are the ones getting kicked out by somebody else. And so in the back of your mind, you just went through another moratorium where you deleted one part of a commercial district and sanitized it to where, because of conflicts. You're never going to get rid of conflicts in your residential area. That's the problem with home-based or residential businesses. But home occupation is the purest. If they can use 80% of their home or have a building with 1,600 square feet, those are minor things.
Yep.
But no outside employees, no vehicles. My daughter went and took piano lessons from a woman. She was in an apartment building, and that didn't work because she didn't have room for kids to stand and wait in her apartment. So you're out in the hallway, and people started complaining. So you can think about all of these things that create problems. It's difficult when you say I think the language was, we'll have a grace period and then we'll bring you into compliance with 12 months. I don't see any of your IUP permit holders coming into compliance if it means you got to become a home occupation.
Yeah, and it would just be compliance with their existing
With
permit.
their original
Yep,
permit.
with their original permit.
Just
yep.
want to make that clarification. So that's not throwing existing people under the bus. And I want to make that clear. So that's a perfect clarification.
Yep.
And Janet, I never want anybody, if you go this route, don't have home occupation 1 and home occupation 2, because people get confused. And one person who has the real home occupation gets a notice that says there's a home occupation being considered for so-and-so. They don't show up at the meeting, and then they find out that home occupation 2 has an outside employer or whatever, so keep your terms distinct no matter which route you go.
Yeah, we were just looking at what other communities used, and they used that, or they used home occupation with permit or without permit, and essentially that's what the 1 and 2 meant, was without permit was 1 and with permit was 2.
And I'm just speaking from experience.
No, it's okay.
When you work in communities and people complain, well, my home occupation doesn't allow this, and so there's confusion in the terminology. And the compliance issue, I apologize, I was dozing. If your compliance is you meet the terms of all of those, that's great. And then that brings up Barb's comment when she was talking about all these others that maybe never got permits. What do you do with them? Well, they, unfortunately have some rights too if they've been here for 20 years, whether they had an IUP or a CUP or no permit. You just can't get rid of them. But if your purpose is to communicate to people and say, you know what, this creates impacts, and we are going to turn you into the county. We want you to pay your fair share. The transparency is the way to go. I developed a non-farm, home-based business ordinance for a pure agricultural community just south of Hastings. And they were being overrun with contractors, landscape companies, and electricians, and whatever. And they all came to all the meetings, and the people said, we don't want the trucks on the road. We don't like all your trucks sitting in the yard. We don't like it when you haul back excess dirt from jobs. And they kind of ironed it out. And we went through a process because they had 33 unregistered or illegal businesses that had come to the community in about a 10-year period. And we said, we're going to create a 3-year process. You all have to get an interim use permit. And when I retired, whenever that was, they were about halfway through that process. But I also heard the same comments that we just permitted this guy and now he's got 6 trucks instead of 4. And that's what happens. And the less you have to regulate, I mean, how many staff in this building are you going to send out when you get complaints? There we go. So that's, to me, that's the issue. If you can't keep up with this, then you just say no. And eventually the phone stops ringing. The realtors understand if you have a real home occupation, you're welcome to come to this community. If you want a business, go find some property. And you know what? They keep going further. They're going to go up to Stacy and get away with it for a while, or up in Itasca or wherever. And so it's the color and the makeup and the choice you make for your community, why it's policy. You have to decide what do you want? And then no matter what you do, just remember, we make ordinances for the 10% of people who don't ever obey any rules. You're just going to get people to do it anyway. So did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I have a question, 2 questions actually. One is in some communities, like Medina and stuff, they had different residential zones that would accommodate different things. So, what I'm thinking is, if you're on the north end of our city where the lots might be 40 to 80 acres and you really don't have neighbors, I don't know if there's businesses out there or not. I'm just throwing that on as something to think about. Is that something we should contemplate, that there might be places in this city that truly you could have some of those higher impact businesses and not bother anybody? And, should we think about that? And then the second thing I want to bring up is I'm really, I'm not opposed to this approach. On the surface, I haven't really thought about it. Obviously, we just are hearing about it today. But I do know that what we tried to do before didn't work. I mean, we were all going crazy just trying to figure out all the different permutations and stuff. So I welcome a different approach to this. But one thing I don't think is going to fit, and I don't know how I feel about whether we just say we don't want them, are people who have businesses that have large animals. So you've got people who board horses, who offer riding lessons, and especially there's a group of people that board horses just during the racing season, and they're a big part of what Running Aces needs. I don't know, they wouldn't fit into home occupation, but I don't know if you want to think about, and I don't know if there's other examples like that, but my fear is that I think we should all really think about the businesses that we know and try to identify some of those that aren't going to fit so neat and tidy into this, and then figure out, what do we do with those?
You said verbal wasn't a business.
Right. So Elizabeth and I talked a little bit in this context of and it's part of the direction that the council gave back in November, was what is a business, right? And so currently as defined, it's an occupation, business, or activity intended to generate a profit in connection with a dwelling unit or conducted in a dwelling unit. That's what the home occupation definition says. And so in terms of the definitions, we, in talking about our zoning ordinance over the course of the past year and a half, we've talked about why definitions matter. And one of the questions that we talked about as a staff was, do short-term rentals come under this concept of home occupation? And what I would suggest is that they don't, because number one, we have a family as a trigger in our home occupation, which is a definition we can talk about that's sort of, that you have to live and operate it at the same time. So more like, so maybe a B&B would fall under that definition. But a short-term rental potentially would, or short-term rental, in my opinion, would not. In terms of horse boarding, I think that probably does fall in. I'd be interested to hear how the city has treated those operations in the past.
We haven't regulated them.
We haven't regulated them.
And that's the part that I think is going to be a challenge, is that how many IUPs do we have, Elizabeth? 12? I mean, it's a very small number of residential zone businesses that have IUPs. I can guarantee you, Sean, that when you get that list and you start paring through it, there are hundreds of them out there. Now, not all of them may be viable anymore, and maybe the vast majority of them will fit within the definition of this home occupation. But I think there are many, many more businesses out there that are running out of residences, pole barns, garages, all of the above. And I'm not saying that we should say that that's okay. I'm just saying that I think it's not as easy as saying, oh, if they do nails or hair or whatever. I think those are the teeny tiny percentage. I think it's more the other stuff that you might not just sort of readily think about, and it's hard to even think about like how you come up with.
Let's talk about those businesses. I mean, I think that that's really helpful in crafting our policy and looking at what this definition is today, because we look at it through one lens. Okay, this is allowed. This would be fine. This would be fine. These are all things. These are all easily met metrics. But what are those other businesses?
So think about. I mean, I gave you the example of someone who boards horses or gives riding lessons. Okay, there's several of those here in this city. There's also people who have animals and they do little petting zoos on the side. So they've got a whole menagerie of farm animals, and they take them around and they do petting zoos. Maybe, I don't know, not full time, but during the and so that's a business. You might have people who breed. So we've got somebody on one end of town that has a bunch of llamas, and they breed them and they sell them. And so that's a business.
The thing with the horse boarding, because my niece boards her horse, is you might have just the person that owns it as an employee. Where they fall in is those people that board those horses have to come every day and take care of the horse, and then they have training lessons if you want that. So they might not be under the employee part of it, but they do have people coming regularly every day.
Or they have, I mean, there is a business near me that, and they're really important to the track, and there are huge, and I'm not talking about 2 horses, I'm talking about 8 or 10 horse trailers that are as heavy as a semi going up and down that residential street multiple times a week, bringing horses there, bringing horses back.
And those uses have likely been there.
They've been there for a while, but I don't know that they've been there for 15 years. I mean, that's part of the challenge too, is because what I thought I heard earlier is we don't even know how long our ordinance has been in. Well, so you have to pick a date, obviously, but I think
we believe it's 2008, but we need to look at the old ordinance. So I think that's the most recent amendment. But the requirement to move to an IUP as compared to a CUP, because there were CUPs before this.
For a while, we had a transitionary permit, which Bill made that word up.
Well, I can't take any responsibility for whatever Bill did.
Anyway,
but nonetheless.
And I'm bringing it up not because I don't want to get into, a really long discussion. I'm just suggesting that we all think about those businesses that don't fit in that nice box, because I think there's a few out there.
Well, so the more significant question for you all is whether you want to see more of those businesses here, because we can address the existing businesses through a process just like Dean described. But the question is, should there be more of them, number one? And then also, you raise the issue of whether there are certain areas of the city that just are less dense than others. And the other option is, of course, to have different zoning districts that apply, so not just your rural residential. Dean, would an amendment to a larger lot beyond rural residential district in a certain area of the city, would that require a comp plan amendment, do you think?
But Megan, wouldn't the horse people, by Janet, wouldn't they just register as a business and get an IUP?
No, I mean, what I heard earlier is there won't be IUPs. It'll be a permitted use. So you either fit it or you don't.
Yeah.
Yep, I suppose you can say if it's over 10 acres or something like that. I mean, you can trigger a trigger.
But they would have to come in for a permit?
No.
Well, yep, so they would have to register as a business if they fell within, so let's say they started in next year, and we adopted this just along the same structure that I've presented tonight. They would come in, they'd say, I'm opening a horse boarding facility, and I plan to have employees that are not my family members. And that would really be the trigger in here. Within your existing ordinance as it stands today. And then, of course, the percentage of the accessory building to be used in furtherance of the business. Those would be the two things that would be triggered by if you just adopted this and eliminated the residential zone business. That they would either be permitted as a permitted use as a home occupation, or they would need to either seek some other use or not be allowed within the city. There would not be a path for an IUP in the future.
And I think these I mean, just the examples that I gave, and I'm sure there's others that aren't animal related. I mean, they actually hit a number of these things that they wouldn't meet. Odors, I mean, flies, perhaps equipment, because a lot of times they have a bunch of horse trailers parked somewhere because they need them to be able to move them. And I'm not against them at all. And the one that's by me bothers no one. I mean, truly, other than the fact that the trailers are probably hard on the road, they really don't bother anybody. So I think that's what sent us down that rabbit hole that we were in, trying to figure out, like, well, how can we, if they're not bothering anybody, how can we make it work? And then it was just a never-ending
So
process.
then, I think the not bothering anyone, I think the language of the existing ordinance is important. It says detectable to the normal senses off the lot. And this goes to Rob's point. If you're in the center of a 40-acre lot and you do not have employees and you do not have exterior storage, well, Elizabeth, are you okay under the existing home occupation definition? As long as you don't have those two triggers? I think so.
I think so. I'm just thinking to myself, though, I think the definition of business is what's key, because I'll tell you that if someone called me and said, I want to rent a room in my house, you know what I mean, do you have an ordinance? I would say no. I wouldn't say that was a business. So, you know what I mean? So renting a barn stall, is that really a business, or is it just income?
But what you bring up is a really good point, because I just had this discussion with a friend of mine who lives in Anoka, and her neighbor rents out rooms in her house to traveling nurses and to whatever. There are people coming and going all the time, sometimes not so savory, sometimes, they've had problems with drugs, and not from the nurses, but from others. So I would say that is a business. I mean, she rents out rooms in her house on a consistent basis to people who don't live there, and they come and go, and they create impacts on neighbors. And so I would say that was a business. If you rent something out on a temporary basis, that might be different. But if you're doing that as part of, I'm not saying we should or we shouldn't. That's what's really a challenge about this, is trying to think of all the different permutations and whether or not that's going to fit in our more simplified approach.
So let's think about it this way. The reason we started on this 1 or 2 or 3 years ago was people complaining about businesses next door. I'm thinking about, there's somebody with about 10 snowplows somewhere down by Ron's place. So he's snowplowing all day and snowplowing all night, and all summer long they're piled up growing itchweed around them. So what is everybody's view of your community, our community? Do you want more of that? Or if you've got $1 million house or a $500,000 house, do you want to look out over somebody's pile of junk just because they were allowed to bring it? And they can go to Stacy, or they can go to Itasca, or they can go anywhere they want. I believe any property in Columbus will sell in a month, or maybe 6 weeks now the interest is up, giving the people who are selling a way to capitalize on their profits. And if somebody wants to come there and have a house and a dog and a couple of kids, God bless them. If you want to bring 6 dump trucks and 6 workers to drive them, is that what we want in our community? And as we become less rural, when I was young, everybody had their own dump truck and a team of horses and everything else. But that's all changed, and it's not going back that
Were
way.
women wearing bonnets and hoop skirts?
And they didn't allow the ladies to drive the horses. No. So that's what we have to think about. What's going to happen in 10 or 20 or 30 years? And where do you want it to go? And once somebody builds their big pole barn and buys all their dump trucks, you're worse off than saying no before they started.
Right, that's the point of this, is to make it stop now while we have the chance. Because there's a lot of people moving up or from other communities that aren't allowing it again, so they're coming to Columbus. We have a lot of businesses that have been pushed out of Blaine and, Lino Lakes.
White Bear Lake, yeah.
And then we get all of this truck traffic and so forth. That's not what we want for this community. And as far as the residential businesses, you still have to, you're getting some people that are building really, really nice homes, and they're paying a lot of taxes. So why should somebody be able to move in next to them and bring in dump trucks and everything else? You don't want that. Yes, we have it, but I think you should draw a line and say, no more. You want more residential people that are paying taxes, and you don't want people that are using the land to run commercial businesses so they don't have to pay commercial taxes. They're cheating the city and the county and other residents who have to pick up those taxes.
That's true. And also, as long as we protect the people who are already here, which we've all listened to and discussed already. Judy, what were you going to say?
Well, I think the thing we have to be thinking about first is, what do we want the community to look like? To what you just said, Jesse, and then make these ordinances so that they meet our vision of what we want the community to look like.
Well,
If I can, too. For the people who don't know me, the Planning Commission, Sean Lassard, Co-Compliance Inspector, new one. And I recently retired from just under 20 years in law enforcement. I won't go through my resume, but I was involved in some higher-end investigations. And I will say that no matter what the law, code, ordinance says, there's always going to be room for interpretation, even as simplified as it is. And there's always going to be gray, even in the black and white. But the more boiled down it gets to, the less liability and issues there are down the road. So whatever the council adopts, I would just have that in the back of your head too, is enforceability. How do we enforce the code in a uniform way to not make it, or to make it as clear and as concise and distinct as possible? It's this, and let's take as much gray out of it as we can. So how do we enforce whatever we're going to adopt, right? Is my 2 cents, only because it's my new job. But it's some of the laws that state of Minnesota has passed in the last 20 years or before my time as a copper are so convoluted and so confusing that I know for a fact, because I was one of them, I wouldn't even deal with certain types of crimes because the law was so confusing and the process was so difficult. So the enforceability of anything that's adopted should be at least thought of.
Yep,
Thank you.
definitely.
Yeah, this is Rob. I guess I kind of want to go back to the mayor's point about the plows and things like that. I just wanted to be clear, that's definitely not what I want to see in our community, right? But maybe somebody that has 2 trucks and they plow and they mow grass in the summer, right? But they keep that stuff in their pole barn in the summer. That's, I guess, what I'm more leaning towards. I don't want somebody with 3 dump trucks next to me, right? I mean, everyone on the council knows what I live 2
So say,
doors
don't you
down
already
from,
have
so,
that?
Yeah. Actually, 3 box trucks, 15 vehicles, yeah, forklifts, but, I have an acre and a half of property. There's a lot of other people that have a lot more acreage, right? So, I guess.
Well, that goes back to indoor storage, making it invisible, soundproof, smell-proof, invisible. And again, if you tell them no tomorrow morning, and they go look somewhere else and take their money and go buy something else, there's no harm, no foul, because they haven't invested and put up a pole barn and bought a new dump truck. So nobody's being hurt at that point, especially with the red hot market or the fairly hot market, still for the people who want to sell, the older people who want to move to Cherrywood Hills or whatever it's called. And so that makes it easier. You're just stopping problems from the future. Because as soon as somebody moves in with a new project, somebody else is going to be calling the city hall to see, is it legal? Can they do it? Do they have a permit? Why are they on the streets at 7 o'clock in the morning and all of that? So if we go down this road, as we go down this road, let's cut it and dry it and make it easier in the future, I guess, is my thought.
I think one of the effective things that we did when we looked at our commercial districts was we outlined what exists today. And so I would suggest to you that as staff brings this forward, especially I'm thinking in particularly with a horse boarding facility, that may be a very excellent use for us to add to our rural residential district. And that existing horse boarding facilities are legal non-conforming uses, but then any new facility would require a CUP. Very standard within communities to see that use regulated by a CUP. And so to take a accounting essentially of what we know we have, the types of businesses that we have, and then to put it in a really simple checklist form for us to review together that says this is a home occupation as currently drafted, or do you need to, tweaking this home occupation definition to allow for the entirety of your pole barn to be utilized for the home occupation, to not have some of these more specific or stringent requirements, and then say, okay, what is the percentage that either falls into the definition that we're presenting to you today as it exists, has some other rights and titles of the property, or we think is a good use, and so we would revise our zoning ordinance to create flexibility for it. I think that that's a path forward so that we have real specifics. And then you also have policy levers to look at when it comes to looking at the definition of a home occupation and what you would want to see in it.
So Megan, do you anticipate with the new legislation about cannabis, even a whole nother layer of home businesses that could be operating that, I mean, are legal, especially as they, get their licensing entities in place? I mean, I brought that up with Elizabeth, as we talked about the public access or the public use and stuff, that it concerns me that, that we need to get on top of that too. And that's a whole brand new opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, to sort of deviate from our conversation about home occupations, the cannabis ordinance, the cannabis statute is going to have a lot of nuance to it, and we still don't really have I heard a news story on my way here today about how the Red Lake Nation has opened the first dispensary in the state, but other dispensaries will not be opening until those licensing requirements are set by the new agency. So a couple of things are in play here. Number one, there is going to be a licensing process. There is currently a process within the statute for growing at your home, and a limitation on the number of plants you can have and regulations around that, but enforcement is going to be the big question for that statewide agency to build out. And then number three, as a city, you do have options here when it comes to thinking about how you're going to regulate cannabis, and I know that Bill talked about that to some extent in your council meeting last week. But specifically, we've talked about the moratoria that we used for this particular issue, and we used a moratorium also within the CI district in terms of new development. Those moratorium are limited to 1 year for zoning moratoria unless 3 very narrow exceptions apply. But one of the narrow exceptions is for other statutes that authorize a longer-term moratoria. And the state law around cannabis allows cities to adopt a moratorium that is effective through, I believe, January of 2025. And that's consistent with the licensing timeline that the state agency has set for itself. And so that would allow you to, again, conduct a study to determine how you're going to, what authority you have to regulate it within specifically your zoning ordinance, because that's where the local authority still lies, and to really learn more and for us to be able to observe this process as it plays out at the state level. And it certainly is within the council's authority. There's no public notice requirement for adopting a moratorium. It's certainly within the council's authority at this meeting tonight to direct staff to bring back that resolution to your next council meeting, if that's something that you wish to pursue.
I mean, I would vote for that, but I also feel, even though I know we had a moratorium on this, I think there's a different set of questions on this residential zone business, and I would love to believe it's going to be as cut and dry as what you presented, but I think as we think about it more, it won't be. And so I'm wondering whether we should also think about, do we want to declare another moratorium with another set of questions to give us an opportunity to really think this through, and also staff and puts the staff in a better place that when, somebody calls and says, hey, I'm thinking about ABC there, and it's like, there's a moratorium, so, call back in 9 months or whatever. I mean, I just feel like you're not having to make those giant leaps of faith as we're trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah, I think I would recommend, rather than adopting a secondary moratorium, because the moratorium language within Minnesota statutes is pretty prescriptive, because they want cities to move forward and sort of be able to take action for people to make application. And so the effectiveness of a secondary moratorium has, there's some not great case law there. But the process that you could take, right, is that we can fast track this for your review. We can adopt a more restrictive approach, and then we can always expand it moving forward. So if you run into issues, so to adopt a more restrictive home occupation standard, remove the IUP flexibility, and then if it presents issues, that you expand it and you create flexibility there.
This is Barb. I'm wondering if we do that, is there, because we're working not on full information here, at least I don't have all the information, about precisely what existing home businesses are causing the problems. Can we get a list of, you don't have to name them, but just say, so-and-so has 5 trucks and runs them, 7 a.m. till 10 p.m., or you mentioned somebody with dumpsters and stuff. Can we get a list so that we know what kind of businesses are causing the most problems?
Or in the past caused problems.
Right.
Some of them are gone.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the, when we talk about, and I agree, I guess I would rather fast track than put another moratorium on. How many, and Elizabeth, do you know how many people came to us and asked for a residential home business IUP between the time that our moratorium expired in November and today?
There were two, there were two businesses that came in. They weren't residential zone businesses that we put on hold that now we're working with. But as far as residential zone businesses, I can't think of any that we put, what I would say on hold. What we put on hold was if they expired. You know what I mean? We said,
Oh, okay.
we said you have an extra time, because in the midst of that, if they expired, then we gave them an extra 18 months, and they're kind of in their 18 months now. We don't have that many interim use permits, and I just think that most people are operating without them. And it hasn't been a problem because they haven't created impacts. The ones that have created impacts, we've tried to address, and the problem is they don't know what to do at this point, because they haven't put capital away to you know, they didn't treat themselves as an incubator business, saying I'm gonna be in the community or in my home for 5 years, and I'm gonna put money away, and I'm gonna move to the commercial district, which is initially what this was supposed to be, a residential zone business. They found that they can't function. They don't have enough money to function in a commercial district. So it is kind of unfortunate, because we would need another mechanism to help these people transition with employees and dumpsters and trucks and snow plows and all those sorts of things, because people do complain about it, but then the flip side, nobody wants to put them out of business because it's their livelihood.
I would also say that, I mean, I think it's informative to get, you know, the types of complaints, but I mean, I know from people who've contacted me, there are businesses that people have complained and they've given up because we didn't have a Sean and we didn't do anything about it. So just the lack of complaints doesn't mean that they're not causing an impact or that they haven't been noticed. So I would even venture to guess that more people than not maybe notice and just say, well, whatever, because they're not going to do anything about it anyway.
Well, I know that Sean shared with me, he's only been here since July 5th, and he hit the ground running. And so he's keeping some statistics. And so he's already resolved 23 complaints in the short time he's been here.
Oh,
So the word's getting out that he's here. And so, again, and some of them are simple. Maybe it's just a simple phone call, maybe it's just a simple, visit. But I think there hasn't been a negative impact at all. As a matter of fact, I think it's just the opposite. I think it's been a good thing, and people have been receptive, so.
Very good.
So I'm going to go back to my question about the moratorium. So tell me again why you don't recommend that?
So the city's authority to enact a moratorium is specific to the statute. And the statute allows a moratorium to be in place for 12 months and then has these very limited circumstances in which a moratorium can be extended, and then it's only for an additional 6 months. And those three, there's two of them I know off the top of my head. Number one is if you have a comp plan pending before Met Council and you haven't received approval and you need to wait until you have final Met Council approval to adopt the entirety of your ordinance. And number two, the other issue is if it's allowed pursuant to another state law. So the intent of the moratoria law is to specifically restrict cities from placing in long duration moratoria in excess of a year, and to give, to balance the interests between property owners and local regulators. And so what we have here is, we had a period of a year in which we did not accept applications, or if we accepted applications, they were deferred until the expiration of the moratoria. We have people who have not applied for a renewal of their interim use permit in reliance on that sort of saving clause and the additional moratoria. And the concern is that if you adopt a second moratoria that is looking at these same or similar issues, that you are otherwise further going outside of the authority that has been granted you essentially by the legislature. And there are a couple of cases, then they all in particular relate to pawn shops. And so a city adopted a moratoria, was on pawn shops, adopted an ordinance, pawn shop found a way around it, adopted a second moratoria, and the court said in that situation that that the second moratoria was invalid because you had your first bite at the apple, and that was what was allowed under state law. And so my concern is that in adopting sort of a second round of this, that we potentially run afoul of that, when I think we can efficiently and effectively, so in terms of process forward, I think I'm hearing you all say very similar things. I think we have to work out the specifics of how it's going to apply to businesses. I think I'm generally hearing that increased impacts on neighbors is not something that the council and the planning commission is interested in pursuing, but that we want to be really purposeful about making sure our definition is broad enough to allow for reasonable use of property. And then we're also looking to make sure that businesses that may be currently operating that didn't fall within either area are protected in some other way, if they're what we would call a good neighbor business. And I think that we can create that list, bring it back to you all, send it out via email, frankly, for your review, and then talk about the specifics that would need to be changed within this home occupation definition to meet those needs. I think that provides a path forward, and it's a path forward that we can accomplish within a 6-week period of time.
But aren't we talking about two different things? Not the home-based business, but figuring out how to regulate and where to place our pot shops?
Well, I brought two things up, so they're separate. So I think you were in agreement that a moratorium on that would probably be okay.
Absolutely.
But I brought up a second moratorium that would allow us to take on this new set of questions and new set of objectives, which, I think they're very different than what we had started out with, in a way that isn't as, I just don't think we'll get it done in 6 weeks. And I think we have a lot of other stuff going on, and it was great. You were amazing how you were able to complete the commercial Lake Drive thing. That was hard. That was a lot. That was a lot of meetings and a lot of extra time, and we had a real reason. We made a promise that we would get that done so we didn't impact development that was already in process. We don't have that same need with this. So I feel like we could take our time with this. Elizabeth said she only got 2 calls during the whole year, so it's not like they're knocking down our doors. And then we could, not that I don't want to make this a priority, I just don't want it to be that high of a priority that we try to get it done in 6 weeks or even a few months.
So are you saying that even though we don't do another moratorium, we don't fast track it? We take our time, maybe not do a moratorium, but...
I like the idea of a moratorium because it is a different study. It's a different set of questions that we're trying to answer. And it provides the staff some breathing room if they do get calls and they don't fit into the current categories that we have today.
Well, let's just talk about the current categories that we have today, right? Let's sort of just maybe back up a step and talk about, and we can go back to one of the first slides, which is talking about the residential zone business performance standards. You have extensive performance standards for these residential zone businesses. The problem with those standards as they exist so that they can move and shift over time and have additional impacts. But through your interim use permit process, there is no reason that if an applicant came in and they had a more intense use, that you wouldn't, they wouldn't go through the IUP process. They can come before the Planning Commission, they can come before the council. They would have to show all of the standards that we have here, including, and they would have to meet those additional conditions of approval. So you can look at the type of business just like you look at every type of business that comes in for an IUP or a CUP and make a determination that it's a fit for this space or it isn't. I mean, that's the ordinance that you have in place today. The ordinance that the staff's sort of solution and proposal is to remove that level of flexibility, but it doesn't mean that you can't utilize this now for those people who might call in and to still ensure that there are not going to be impacts to the surrounding properties. You make those analyses all the time in terms of the approvals that you give for businesses in the commercial districts in town.
But I think, what we've talked about is, and I heard Barb say very clearly, we don't want new businesses that don't fit into whatever we end up with this new home occupation. And so we wouldn't be able to say no to anything that would be what we don't want in the future, but with a moratorium, we could. And again, it's not, I don't have anything specific in mind. I'm just saying that it buys us time. There isn't anybody knocking down our doors trying to get in, so I don't think we have the risk of the lawsuits or the, you've already done this once kind of thing, because there's so many people lined up wanting to get IUPs from us. And it allows us to be really thoughtful about the process. And, I don't see a downside to it, that's all, other than maybe the optics of it. But that's me. Somebody else can weigh in on that.
I gave my opinion, which was, I think we can not have a moratorium and go, we don't necessarily have to fast track it in 6 weeks, but because there haven't been a ton of people coming through, we could probably take our time, maybe 6.5 weeks. No, 8, 10, 12, something like that. I just don't want, and I know we can stop them, if we started a moratorium and got done in 3 months, we could always lift it. But I think to Megan's point that, potentially we could be setting ourselves up for something that you mentioned.
So there's a couple of ways that residents can challenge a moratorium. They can challenge it saying that the city doesn't have the authority to enact a secondary moratorium, whether they're an applicant or not. So there's sort of a broader base of challenge there. And then there's also the secondary challenge of someone who's coming in as an applicant saying, you can't not take my application. You are required to accept it because this moratorium is ineffective. So there's a couple of different ways. And so both cases that actually discuss this issue are are very much political complaints. And so that's just one of those things that I would caution you in terms of adopting a secondary moratorium, is that there is broad-based standing for someone who is not a person who is necessarily impacted by the moratorium to bring a challenge.
What she said. That's my opinion.
I think if we can have this done in 6 to 8 weeks, we should do it. I mean, it's fresh on everybody's minds right now, and a lot of discussion tonight, and a lot of thought process, and I don't think we should put it aside and wait. I think we should act on it. A lot of work went into this, and I think this is great. So.
Dean, what do you say?
I'm not hearing anybody advancing the notion of RZBs anymore. Just pass an ordinance that rescinds this, finish it, and then you don't hold yourself to 6.
We can do that. We could.
Well, you have to have a public hearing, but you could just repeal 7A806, and then if you change your mind, you bring it back.
Yeah.
And that eliminates Elizabeth from issuing a permit.
Right.
A question could come up legally where somebody says, well, you just eliminated my permit. You have the authority to negotiate with people, whether it says so in your ordinance or not. We do that all the time with every non-conforming business. So if you're really concerned, and I agree with Megan, you can't do another moratorium on this.
Yeah.
Just rescind it. But you have to have an ordinance written up that rescinds it, hold a public hearing, and you're done. And if you change your mind and come back, and like one out of the 13 conditions, you re-adopt it.
Well, and what we're gonna, our plan is to take some of that in the residential home business and move it to the home occupation as we make the update to that one.
Right, and there's no deadline on that.
Right.
You're going to severely restrict the home occupation until you decide how you expand it. I don't see the pressure.
Okay.
But if you're worried that somebody's going to come in and ask for an IUP and then you're stuck with them for 10 years and Barb doesn't want any, well, just rescind it. I mean, it's not so hard. And then you're not wringing your hands that,
Well, I like that idea. I mean, I'm
I like
good with
that
that. I mean, that's, you know, it meets what I was trying to do with the moratorium, and, yeah, so I like that idea. Thank you.
So by rescinding, you're saying we're eliminating this tonight, but coming back to it? Is
whether
that-
it's temporary or permanent, you'd have an ordinance that says council hereby ordains ordinance section 7A806 is repealed, period. I mean,
So if somebody comes in and wants to do a business and they meet the stuff that's in slide 5, the answer would be no, because we rescinded that. Correct?
Yeah.
So that helps put it in perspective if you look at what's in 5, slide 5.
it doesn't hinder at all the progress you make on expanding the home occupation. It's just, it takes the pressure off if one of these two come back, and then you're stuck with them. Because once you get a valid application, then you're stuck with them.
Yep, that's right.
Then you can go work on your pot ordinance.
Not my pot ordinance. I don't plan to grow any or make a business out of that.
We're a farming community, come on.
Be growing it.
So you would need a motion to direct staff to come back with that. Is that what you?
What does everybody else think about that idea?
I like it.
I think it's a great solution.
Rob, you like it?
No, but that's fine. As well.
So then, Megan, how long do you expect it would take to rebuild it? So,
Right, so I think what we would do is we would eliminate, just like Dean said, the section 7A806. And we would have the city council call for a public hearing at its, could call for a public hearing tonight, or could call for a public hearing at its next regular meeting. It would go to, it needs to be noticed, and then it would go to 10 days notice, so it needs to then go to the planning commission and then through the city council. What we would do is adopt we would adopt that, the sort of legally non-conforming use language that we talked about, so that all of those existing businesses that would have that, we would adopt that at the same time. So we would eliminate the right to the IUP, we would adopt legally non-conforming use protection for those businesses that have been in place, giving the 12-month ramp up to ensure they're in compliance, and have Sean visit them with their existing IUP, and then permitted home occupations moving forward. And if there's any direction that the council or the planning commission has with regards to the standards that we already have within our home occupation, like eliminating the 300 square feet requirement, we can do that at the same time. But all of that can be done within a month.
So I guess maybe I'd be more clear then. So we're pretty much going back to the drawing board to put what might possibly be in the 7A806 residential, and marry that up with the home occupation, correct? Is that?
We would just eliminate the 7A 806 entirely.
Yep.
And then rely on the home occupation language as the permitted use within the rural residential district, except of course for those existing businesses.
Okay, and then we'd be looking to bring this and kind of marry possibly that into the home business, or not, or just throw this away?
Well, so this is Dean's approach is, so there's two ways to do this. Number one, we can have another conversation about what this home occupation looks like and delay in eliminating this portion. Or we can eliminate this portion and leave it as it is today, the existing home occupation definition, add a grandfathered use provision in to protect those existing businesses, and then in a future meeting, come back and talk about how we would bring some of the stuff that's in this and mush it into mush is the technical term, into the home occupation definition.
Okay, I guess that's a little more clear.
And the businesses that would be protected are the ones that currently have an IUP. The ones that are operating out of compliance right now would probably continue to operate out of compliance until we get everything defined, and then we would have either a pathway that they could be in compliance or not. Am I getting that right?
Currently have an IUP or have been in operation since 2008.
Yeah. But the vast majority of the home businesses aren't either things. So those people would continue to operate. I mean, they would keep doing what they're doing until we finish this work, and then some of them would fit in the new occupation, or they would be able to fit into the new home occupation, and some of them won't.
Correct.
Anybody? Barb, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the second one's a good,
Judy?
yeah.
And the 2008 is because that's when the last, regulations were made, we think, or?
We have to confirm, we have to look back at the ordinances, but one of the great things about our ordinance now being with American Legal Publishing is that it does have the dates in which it was last amended. And the last time our residential zone business ordinance was amended was April 17th of 2008. And we believe that was when this specific use as it exists today was created as compared to the CUP or the transitional use. Those were two previous ways that we regulated these uses. All of the CUPs run with the land. They're not temporary in nature, so they would automatically already be existing and have rights to continue operations. And of course, we would be providing, so the idea is that in 2008, you were required as a property owner who was running a commercial business out of your home to come in and apply for an IUP. Those people who did not do that in the time between 2008 and today would be in violation of the code. Those people who were already operating prior to 2008 would have protections because the ordinance did not require them to do so at that point in time.
So what do you need, a motion?
I would like a motion and direction.
On two things. The motion and direction would be on the home occupation, and I believe that Janet brought up, we need motion and direction on the
Moratorium.
For, what'd you call them?
Cannabis businesses? No.
Not the businesses, but the dispensaries.
Dispensaries.
The dispensary ordinance.
I was actually thinking broader than just the dispensary. I mean, I was thinking growing or anything else
Isn't that
too.
the whole thing? I mean, isn't it?
I mean, because what I heard on the newscast that you listened to too was the mayor of Lakeville talking about what a great opportunity this is for people as a home-based business, because once they get licensed, they can grow for other and sell to others. They can't today because it's illegal to sell it. You can grow it for your own use, a certain number of plants, but at some point you'll be able to grow it and sell it. And so my thought with the cannabis thing is thinking about the broader question of it all, not just the dispensary.
So what I would recommend, sort of, so stepping off of our home-based business conversation, stepping back into the cannabis realm, what I recommend is that the moratorium resolution that we would bring back for you at the council meeting will cover all of your statutory authority. And then you can work within that over the course until January of 2025.
So your motion would be to direct you to come back with that language.
That's correct.
Okay, so I'll make that motion to direct the city attorney to come back at our next council meeting. Is that enough time?
Yep.
With language that would address the potential of calling a moratorium on cannabis based businesses.
I'll second the motion. Any other discussion or questions? You could have a nice logo.
So I guess I do have a question. So is your idea to eliminate it or put parameters around it to make it?
To study it. And basically, right now, it's not legal, and it won't be till 225, right, is what they're saying? So in the meantime, it's us getting our ducks in a row so that in 225, we know what we want and where we want it, and they'll have a lot of kinks worked out of the law that they currently don't have now, right?
Correct. So at this point in time, the cities do not, cities have licensing authority with regard to tobacco and alcohol and other things like that. Cities are not going to have licensing authority with regard to cannabis. So that's all the licenses are going to come from the state agency. But cities do retain their authority with regard to local zoning authority. And so that's what we're really talking about, is a study of, okay, what would a dispensary look like? There are going to be defined areas of the law that come out as the regulations are built out. We know sort of the bones at this point in time, but there's going to be a lot more. And so this just allows us space to be able to see what those are and to hold on opening any new facility until, whether it's a home-based business, whether it's a dispensary, whether it's the sale of new marijuana at other licensed facilities, until that 2025 date.
And I will say that most cities are adopting this moratorium, and the legislature outlined it in the legislation that we're able to do that. So that I think the intention was to give cities the opportunity to do that, because as other businesses, you can't say no. You can't just say, I'm not going to, the city won't allow them anywhere.
Gotcha.
Anybody else? I'll call for the vote.
Sue, aye.
Lynn, I.
Janet, aye.
Barb, aye.
Judy, aye.
Rob, aye.
And Jesse, aye. Oops, sorry.
Bethany, aye.
And Jesse, aye. You got to speak up.
You go, girl.
You're too quiet today.
She's kind of back there in the shadows. It's kind of hard to see her from here.
Okay, so what's our next direction we need to make?
So the next direction is regarding the home occupation and elimination of Section 7A-806 residential zone business. As I understand it, the direction that I've received from the City Council and from the Planning Commission is that you are directing staff to call for a public hearing and to bring back an ordinance that includes the home occupation standards, a provision to allow legally non-conforming uses to move forward within a 12-month period and to come in compliance with their former IUPs. We're calling them legally non-conforming uses because removal of Section 7A-806 would make them legally non-conforming uses.
And then rescinding the 7A-806, is that?
Correct.
Okay.
Everybody got it?
The motion would be like, so moved.
So moved.
So moved, yes. I'll second.
Anybody- Moved and seconded, yep.
Moved and seconded.
Any other questions or discussion? I'll call for the vote.
Sue, aye.
Lynn, I.
Janet, aye.
Barb, aye.
Judy, aye.
Rob, nay.
Bethany, aye.
And Jesse, aye. So we'll see that in 2 weeks or a month?
It will go to Planning Commission first, so that will be the first meeting. A second is perhaps, we'll have to do the
Yeah, we'll have to-
timeline of the
we'll have to
calculation.
do
We have to look at the schedule.
Yeah.
But likely, I would say, I could generally say for sure the first Planning Commission meeting in September, and then the council meeting to immediately follow after that.
Okay.
I think we missed the bottom lines for the August.
Yep.
Anything else for us, Megan?
Wow.
So I think the other question that was raised in our conversation tonight was short-term housing issues. So we've talked about the different types of businesses that could classify themselves as home-based businesses. We are going to, in the interim, while we're drafting this ordinance, we're also going to come back to you and provide you with that list of the existing businesses in town and continue to work on what the policy would look like for home occupations so that we can expand that consistent with your guidance. But the other question that I have for the Planning Commission and Council is whether you would direct staff to pursue exploring what a short-term rental ordinance might look like.
That's for your verbals, your rentals, those sorts of types of uses.
Airbnb.
Airbnbs, yeah.
Do we want to expand it to short and long-term rental? I mean, just because of the example that I gave you, it might make sense to look at both.
Absolutely.
Your example, would that be short-term?
No, well, I guess it depends on how you define short-term. I think of it as long-term because it's an ongoing rental. It's not like, oh, I'm just doing this for a short period of time and then I'm not going to rent out the rooms anymore.
Okay, because I was thinking short-term would be the Airbnb, so it's, nobody stays there for longer than probably a week or so, but it's rented out every week for the next 3 years.
Yeah, and in this case, it was renting it out for months at a time. Could be months, could be weeks, it depends. I mean, depending on who it was. If it was, a nurses' strike that went on for a long time, or if it was, ad locum or ad locum personnel that was filling holes and they might be here for months. So she had a variety of those kinds of things, but people were coming and going all the time. That's.
Yeah, I definitely think we
Go
should.
ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think we should take a look at both.
Because the issue that I hear on the radio and read about is that somebody buys a house, fixes up, they rent it out to a different frat party every week, so the neighbors are up all night with the parties and the
Right.
booze bottles and the legal cannabis and all of this.
And in
And
in the example.
How do we protect the city and the staff from that?
And in the example I gave you, I think the ordinance in Anoka requires that they can rent out part of their home, but they have to live there. And she doesn't, but she keeps a room in case somebody comes and checks to say, that's where I live. So, I mean, I just think it's worth looking into. too.
So again, it's kind of the vision of what do you want the city to look like? Is it people with real homes and real families, or Malibu Beach or whatever? So do you need direction for that?
No, I think I have sufficient direction. But Mr. Mayor, I would always love a motion.
But I want to say something, because you brought up a good point. A friend of mine's parents built a beautiful place on Chisago, and they decided, the lake life wasn't for them, but they love their neighbors, right? They sold the place to a couple that said they're going to move into it, and they moved into it for a week and left, and now they do the exact same thing and rent that place out every week, and there's a party there every week. It's, yeah.
It happens a lot in the resort areas.
Well, and the sad thing, we're too old to appreciate a good party on the lake.
Wow.
But if you're the neighbor, you don't want to hear it. So the motion would be to direct staff to
To study and to bring back a conversation to the Planning Commission about short-term rental ordinances and to present to the council as well at a workshop.
And add long-term to that, too.
And
And long-term.
Yep, short and long-term
start and
rental.
long. Is there a second?
Second.
I'll call for the vote.
Sue, I.
Lynn, I.
Janet, I.
Barb, aye. Judy, aye.
Rob, aye.
Bethany, aye.
And finally, Jesse, aye. So there we are. Anything more?
That is it for me. Thank you so much.
Let's move on to the Planning Commissioner's report.
Okay, I am just going to tell everybody that we are 6 weeks away from the Columbus Fall Festival. So mark your calendars if you haven't, and if you haven't signed up to volunteer, Janet has a list going.
Let me know if I
Get
can
on the
put your
list,
name
huh?
down. There'll be lots of different things you can do. You can choose your poison.
So my question is, are you getting volunteers?
Well, we haven't really put on a call like that. I've had people, like Bethany told me she would be willing to volunteer. She told me that a long time ago. Hopefully she still is willing to volunteer. I mean, so I've had people tell me that they're willing to. Judy did too. Barb did too. So I've got, yes, I have a list of, and the angels that were in the back, they're there. So I have a list of people that have said yes. But the more volunteers we have, the less number of hours you need to volunteer because we
And the
can
more
split up
fun
the
it will
shifts.
be.
That's right. Plus,
Yep.
we're going to have T-shirts, really cool T-shirts that say, well, I'm not sure what they're going to say, but
I
on the back it'll
survived
say
Fall Fest.
volunteer. Yeah.
Barb, how about you?
What?
Anything to report?
Nothing.
Judy?
No,
Nothing?
nothing.
Bethany, go on.
No, sir.
Nothing. That's it. Dean, anything from you? Oh. All right.
Do we get to say anything as a
No,
council?
It's only council, it's only commissioners
Only
report.
planning commissioners.
I was just going to say, we had a really nice night to unite last night.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
There were
You can say that.
There were 4 places, not 3, actually, and we hit all 4 of them, and I sent pictures to Connor so he could put them on the website. And Sheriff's Department was there, the Fire Department was there with 4 firefighters, and it was really a nice night, and lots of people there at each of the places, and they all had a little different vibe to them. It was fun.
City Administrator,
No report.
Planning and Zoning Tech. Nothing? Anything else from anyone? If not, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
A motion, we adjourn.
In a second?
Judy? I'll second.
And it's seconded. I'll call for the vote.
Sue, I.
Lynn, I.
Janet, aye.
Barb, aye.
Judy, I.
Rob, aye.
Bethany, aye.
And Jesse, aye. Our meeting is adjourned at 8:10. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.